morning, everybody. I'm Fred Kempe. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. It's my privilege to welcome you all today to the first of its kind. We hope not the last of its kind. We think there's going to be a lot of this kind. 360 Open Source Summit here in Warsaw during a particularly special and historic gathering in the Polish capital. You're going to see slogans and T-shirts at this part of the hotel that you won't see on the other part of the hotel, with slogans such as "What the Fact" and "Veni Vici Verified." But this is all taking place not in a vacuum. In North Korea, you see the test of a ballistic missile. You see tensions growing across the Persian Gulf. You see Russia continuing to flex its revisionist muscles. And the work we're doing, the work hopefully all of you are either doing or want to be doing to separate fact from fiction is as important as it's ever been in history. It was 37 years ago, absent about a month or two, that I came to Poland for the first time as a very young correspondent. I'd tell you the exact age, but then you would do the math, and I wouldn't want that. And it was another point in history when freedom and democracy were in question, and when facts were crucial and in debate. I was sent by my employer at the time, Newsweek magazine, to cover some labor unrest in a Polish shipyard called Gdansk. And out of that, strikers became a 10 million strong solidarity movement with the help of the Polish Pope, changed the history of Poland, changed the history of Europe, in my view, changed the history of the world. My job here is not to recount that history, but rather to recall, as a young reporter, the sense of foreboding and opportunity I found in the Poland of 1980. And that a movement of committed, courageous, and ultimately deeply organized individuals with crucial international support from everyone from Swedish labor unions to the Reagan administration turned into a historic change, an historic movement against outside and domestic repression. At that moment, the disinformation was propagated, in my view, in more innocent and transparent ways by a state-controlled press that was broadly disbelieved, even in Poland, where the media was more free than it was in other parts of the Soviet bloc. The role that I and other Western journalists played at that time, when I reflect upon it now, was twofold. First, it was to inform the world through reporting of the courage, the capabilities, the dangers faced by this incredible movement, and to send facts out to the world. But there was a second role that I only learned about later from friends of mine in the Solidarity movement. And that was what we were sending out to the world was coming back into Poland through Radio Free Europe, through BBC, through other channels listened to by shortwave. They would learn where the next strike would take place. What was the next move with the government, with Lech Wałęsa and with Solidarity? Not through their own media, but through us sending it out to the world and then it coming back. One of the great weapons of that time, of freedom, was a fax machine. Labor unions could communicate with each other for the first time in a way where the government and the secret services couldn't listen in. Another weapon was the Polski Fiat. There were hundreds and hundreds of Polski Fiats on the roads of Warsaw in those days. And the largest underground press that ever existed would roll off its newspapers and then distribute them in all these faceless Polski Fiats. And if one of them was captured, it would make no difference to that day's success, because most of them would then get out with their news. Now, I don't tell these stories just to wax nostalgic, though sitting here in was then the Victoria Hotel, not the Sofitel Victoria, but the Victoria Hotel. I'm very nostalgic. This is where we all stayed in those days. So from here, I saw everything from the Polish Pope rallying the crowd, even before the birth of Solidarity in 1979, to water cannons and tear gas, and I was also drenched by the water cannons on the same square the Polish Pope was, because this is where people tended to gather. And then when martial law was there, all that was left was a cross of flowers and branches that Secret Service or the security services would take away every night, and then brave Poles, just as a last showing of their vibrancy, would put out the next day. It was a period of time where it was, in my view, the good guys innovating. They were nimble, they were fast, they were moving. And the oppressors, the less benevolent forces, were cumbersome. They moved slowly. They didn't have a lot of imagination. They weren't very determined. Now, the malevolent forces have been much more innovative. They've been fast-moving. They've been creative. They've learned how to use all the digital tools that you know about. And the white helmets, hopefully many of you, in my view, and I'm not an expert in this field, but in my view, you're playing catch-up, and you're behind. What's as true now as it was then, however, is that whoever wins the information wars is going to win in general. The stakes are massive. The playing field is enormously complex. And that's why the Atlantic Council felt we had to go from being not just a think tank, but also a fact tank fighting the disinformation war. And hopefully, through what you do in the next 2 days, helping to create our own sort of mini solidarity of people who want to join in that effort. As crucial as it was then in 1980, the opponents are more skilled and the opponents of freedom, of democracy, are more skilled and more capable today. And the forces of good are less, in my view, determined and less effective. That must change if we are to save all the accomplishments of the past 70 years since World War II of what has become the liberal international order. That's why we're here. That's why the Atlantic Council supports these efforts. The historic moment now is no less important than it was 37 years ago. The outcome at that time was uncertain as well. Who ever thought communism would fall, the Soviet Union would collapse without violence, without a war, that the European Union would expand its borders, that NATO would expand its borders, that the borders of democracy would go out. It was uncertain. It was entirely unexpected. We, at that time, were just as worried about a Soviet invasion that would have changed things for all time. This isn't a game. The adversaries to freedom were overcome then, partially. Values were defended then, not entirely, but to good measure. But the adversaries to freedom are there again. And I would say they're more resourceful. The values have to be defended again. The outcomes to be desired are as uncertain now as they were then. In short, your work, our work, has meaning. We're more connected and engaged than any point in human history. Google Fiber has an internet connection speed of 1 gigabit per second. That's 1 billion bytes per second compared to the 75 bytes per second that the telewriter transmitted that I used in this hotel to send out my stories. That's when I didn't use my technological breakthrough Tandy. Now, many of you will not know what that is, but it had 4 little lines on it. It was the earliest kind of communication computer. And it had a coupler that you put on your telephone. And if you were lucky, you could actually send out your story with this thing. But if the Secret Service picked up the phone and tried to listen on your call and there was a click, it would break the signal. And so it was very rare that you could ever get a story out from Poland using the Tandy. Facebook boasts an online community larger than any nation state and crossed the threshold of 2 billion users in the last few weeks. You're likely tracking now what people are tweeting about this event, or you're tracking what our speaker of later today in Warsaw is tweeting. One really wonders how Ronald Reagan got all that history done without tweets. Our unprecedented connectivity is a tool. It doesn't have a political agenda. Its enormous potential can be harnessed for good or for evil. For instance, the same social media platforms that were used to organize the recent anti-corruption protests across Russia were used by authorities to identify and round up the organizers of those protests. Russian hackers target US and French presidential candidates and leak stolen mails. Russian soldiers fight a secret war in Ukraine, but betray their presence by their use of social media. Macedonian teenagers make up fake stories about the US election to make money from ads and send shockwaves through the social media. So they're doing it for money, not for political change, but it brings about political change. The digital world is a flood of information and disinformation, and like a real flood, it can cause enormous damage to societies that are unprepared, such as the United States in the 2016 election. But at the same time, that flood can be beneficial, bringing us new ideas, new resources, new relationships around the world. The world you're all going into could be one of the most promising that history's ever seen. Medical breakthrough, education breakthrough, alleviation of poverty. Or, if we don't work together to shape the future, chaos or less benevolent forces could rule the day. And that's why we're here today. We're moving from talk to action. Just as the Solidarity movement did then. Imagine if it had just remained talk and not action, where we would be today in Poland and in Europe. 360 OS is designed not to simply discuss the threat of disinformation, but crowdsource techniques to confront it. We're building a community of people adapted to this breakthrough technology in order to cultivate how we expose falsehoods and fake news, document human rights abuses, uncover corruption, get ground truth in conflict zones, and report the actuality of global events in real time. The slow-moving work of a think tank doing papers to gather dust on shelves is not up to today's tasks. You are on the front lines of building resilience in the digital world. And our work doesn't end when we leave the room. That's where it begins, as does our solidarity. So thank you for joining us today, and thank you for your interest in this work. And if you're really active in this work, thank you for that activism, because it really is deeply needed, and this cause is bigger than any one person in this room. Thank you very much.